A lot of the problems in the world are caused by people defaulting to the view of the way they were raised, or their own culture is the only right one and everyone else is wrong. Typically, I think you'll find that, we're all a mix of right and wrong. And if you can take the best bits and steal the best bits from other people and integrate them, you can have a kind of an enjoyable life and learn a lot.
Konnichiwa, minasan. Business Success Japan no podcast e youkoso. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Business Success Japan podcast. This is your host, Liddy Buchelman. My main goal here is to create an easily accessible resource for those who want to develop Japan-specific communication skills, especially in business. While I can't and won't promise to make you fluent in Japanese, I hope that you will walk away from each episode with a skill, piece of information, or shift in mindset that will help you be more effective in your interactions with Japanese business people. A quick reminder to please rate and review the podcast if you haven't had the chance already. It goes a long way to helping others find the podcast and learn more, and it also helps me keep going as an independent creator. So, thanks in advance. In today's episode, I'm chatting with Paul Roberts, a Tokyo-based IT recruiter with over 20 years of experience in the industry. He speaks a fair amount about his career during the interview, so I will let him share his experience in his own words later on. But before we get into today's interview, let's go over some Japanese. In the previous episode, we learned the word for a club or activity group that's usually associated with school or university life. Sakuru. Sa-a-ku-ru. Sakuru. Today, Paul brings up a word that I'm sure we've mentioned in previous episodes, but I haven't officially gone over yet. Me-i-shi. 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 Me-i-shi is the word for business cards in Japanese. While you are likely familiar with their importance in your native country's business culture, me-i-shi definitely have a special significance in Japan that makes it important to know how to treat them with proper respect. Check out the description of this episode to find links to past episodes where you can learn more. But without any further delay, let's get into today's conversation with Paul Roberts. All right, could you please tell my audience a little bit about you?
Right, so I'm Paul Roberts. I'm a technology recruiter in Tokyo. I was born in the UK, in Manchester. My dad's English, my mother's Irish. When I was 10 years old, I moved to Kilkenny in the Republic of Ireland, countryside, and grew up there. Interested in computers from a young age, from about 10 or 11 years old, mostly for playing games. So I learned how to program as well. And I went to college, studied computer science in the early 90s. After that, I went to London, joined an Irish software company, moved to London to work in their London office for about 5 years. And while I was there, made some Japanese friends, came over to Japan on a holiday in 98. Had a great time. It was just a 2-week holiday, Tokyo and Kyoto, but really enjoyed things. Went back to London. It was grey and cold and rainy, and I decided I'd go to Japan for a bit longer in the summer of 99. I'd worked in the company about 5 years, so time for a job change. I thought I'd go to Japan for 3 to 6 months, maybe look for a job if possible. If not, come back to London or go to Dublin and get another job back in IT. So basically that's what I did. I packed my bags, packed my rucksack in this July 99, headed over to Japan, found a job, and I've been here ever since.
Yeah, that's awesome. So why did you decide to stick around in Japan? Like you said, you were thinking that you'd just stop by and leave after a little bit.
I think a lot of it was finding a job and then kind of settling in. So initially I went to Kyoto and spent the summer of 99 in Kyoto. I went to Japanese school for a few months, made some friends, explored Kyoto, which was great. I met an IT engineer in the pub in Kyoto. He gave me his agent's business card and told me that there were companies hiring IT people in Tokyo. Foreign companies like the banks, investment banks were growing in Japan at the time. The government had deregulated, so there was work there. I thought, well, I'll give that a go. So I got in touch with that agent, came up to Tokyo, met that agency and a couple of others. The work I'd done in London was quite niche, so it didn't really suit the jobs available at that time, which were mostly kind of desktop support. I'd done application support for salespeople and things like that, so it was quite different. One of the agencies I'd met was hiring salespeople. I could speak English, which was important to work with the foreign companies. I had some IT background and understanding, and I was available to start immediately once I had a visa. So kind of things kind of fell into place. So I took the job. I thought, okay, I'll do this for a year. I'll kind of learn some of the culture and business culture and build up sales skills, which I didn't have. And I think once I started working, it was an exciting time in the early 2000s, lots of growth, lots of expansion of foreign companies here, lots of demand for IT people. I made friends with my coworkers, candidates, customers, and just enjoyed living in Tokyo. So 1 year kind of stretched out to 3. I had 3-year visas, so I just would kind of aim for the next visa renewal. And pretty soon, you're settled in, you've got a life, you've got friends, you've got a routine. I enjoyed the work I was doing immensely. And so, kind of thinking of going back to London or going to do something else. Those kind of thoughts kind of sort of drifted away because I was having too much fun doing what I was doing here.
Yeah. So did you find that companies were pretty willing to help you renew your visa? Is the main issue just having companies sponsor your visa in the first place? How does that really work?
Yeah, I think the key is kind of getting that first visa and getting kind of local here. Once you're here and established, even if it's just a year or two, then if you want to move around within the market, it's reasonably easy. Japanese visas, work visas, stay person. They're not tied to the company. So you can move companies. The new company, you just submit a form to say that you've moved. So you're quite flexible and quite mobile. So finding that first job is kind of the key. Once you're here and you're a local, then other companies you're seen as low risk. You're already here. You have a life here. You've got an apartment and friends. So then it's much easier to kind of move around. And the visa renewal, the paperwork for visa sponsorships and visa renewals is pretty straightforward. And it's basically filling in forms. And the bureaucracy is fairly efficient. If you meet the requirements for visas, you're going to get one. It's no great overhead for companies to renew your visa and things like that. But getting that first one and getting here initially is the main hurdle, I think, for most people.
Yeah. Sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but now I'm curious because so many people go over to Japan as English teachers.
Yes.
And I know Kaiwa, you get the general humanities visa.
Yeah.
If you go over on like the JET program, you'll have an instructor visa, which is more limited in the types of work you can do. Is that a problem with shifting jobs, or is it pretty straightforward for companies to help you move your visa over?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's just kind of a change of status process. So again, it's submitting some forms. So it's quite straightforward. Actually, the English teaching route, I think, is a great route to get established. I've got friends here who are vice presidents of banks and APAC heads of things. And they started off 20 years ago working at Nova and GIOS and other English teaching kind of conversational schools. And there's also a great community of people who came over in the JET program as well. So especially I know lots of people with IT backgrounds came over on JET a couple of years. One of the great things about the JET program is you're typically outside of Tokyo. So if you're in the more rural area, there's more opportunity and more kind of push to learn Japanese. So a couple of years in the countryside, get some Japanese skills, and then maybe go back into IT or your previous career. So it's a fantastic way to get here. I'm of my close circle of friends, I'm one of the few who came over as an IT person and got an engineer visa. Most of my friends came over, worked as teachers, and then kind of got into IT or other kinds of business and just kind of moved their visas over. So it's pretty straightforward. The visa requirements, basic visa requirements, are reasonably strict. Japan is looking to get experienced people when people are coming from overseas. If you look at white collar work, especially so, an undergraduate degree, 4-year degree is typically required. If you don't have that, you generally would need 10 years of documented work experience in your field to be able to kind of get a visa that way. Most people will use a university degree. There's also an IT qualification from the Philippines. I forget the name of it, but I can send you details later, that the Japanese government recognizes. So sometimes people will go to the Philippines, take that certification, and then use that as a way to get a visa here. The government has opened up kind of non-skilled labor or semi-skilled labor positions more recently in areas like nursing and healthcare, construction, because there's a lack of manpower, basically a lack of bodies to provide services in those areas. So the requirements in those areas are different. Typically, nurses would require nursing certifications and Japanese language skills, things like that. So there's various different options, but in the sort of the white collar world of business, it's typically undergraduate degree and kind of getting into a sort of a skilled type role from there.
Mm-hmm. And luckily, it doesn't matter what your graduate degree is.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So I've got friends. Friend of mine is a head of HR. He studied archaeology. Another friend is a director in an investment bank. He studied political science. So the government's kind of looking for kind of overall proof of education, not necessarily tied to what you're doing. The sponsoring company does have to submit documentation to say why they want to hire you rather than somebody who's already here or a Japanese local. But again, depending on perhaps your work experience, availability, language skills, other things like that, knowledge that you're bringing in. If you're bringing in knowledge that's kind of low on the ground here, the government is open to that. So it's one way to kind of get the skill levels up in Japan, is bring in qualified experts from overseas.
Yeah. So that kind of ties into something you said on your LinkedIn profile, that you find Tokyo to be a particularly challenging market because you're involved with recruiting technical talent. So could you talk a little bit more about that, especially in Tokyo?
Yeah. So my role, I currently work with a company called Smart Partners. It's an IT recruiter. We're a small 4-person company. Our founder is an American, Jason DeLuca from California. Jason and I have worked together several times in the past. We know each other about 20 years. I actually met him as a candidate. I took him for a job interview. He didn't get the job, but the company I was working for hired him the next week as a salesperson. So, just opportunity and some good luck can play a part. Japan doesn't have a strong reputation, track record of producing world-class IT graduates. There are some good schools here, but the volumes of people graduating is quite low. In typical Japanese companies, IT people have either joined as new graduates and been trained by the company in the company's ways of working or doing IT. So it's not uncommon, so a company like IBM will hire new graduates from any kind of business field and spend 2 years training them to be Java developers or programmers. And they know the IBM way of developing, and then they'll kind of embark upon IT careers. So there's a low kind of production of graduates. Also, English levels here are generally pretty low. I think there was a survey last year by a Swiss education foundation of 100 countries. Japan came about 53rd on the list. So you've got the kind of Scandinavian countries at the top, places like Singapore, other places like that. And Japan was very much mid-level behind South Korea and other countries. So English is the language of IT. The innovations are being done, say, in the US or other countries. The information's out there in IT. So in Japan, it's got to be filtered through perhaps English speakers who are writing blogs or books to kind of filter things into Japanese. So there's a kind of a delay there of information, or a roadblock to information about technology being distributed within Japan. So with that lack of kind of IT talent, kind of opportunities then, companies are looking for highly skilled people, and it's very difficult to find people locally. I think people have an image of Japan as a high-tech country. You kind of look from overseas. That's very much kind of consumer focused, I think. It's a legacy of the 80s and Sony and the kind of consumer electronics. It's not information technology. I think if you're listening to this overseas, you're probably not using a Japanese-made phone. You're not using a Japanese-made operating system on your computer. You may have very few Japanese applications other than perhaps language learning or things like that. So, kind of in the tech space, it's not being really driven from Japan. So all of that, kind of companies realize they need to implement modern IT, a lack of people here then to do that. So you get a very competitive space, especially then when it comes to kind of English speaking people as well. There are a lot of foreign companies here. There are Japanese companies who now work in English. So they're all competing for that kind of limited pool of talent. That does, however, open up the opportunities for people to come from abroad. So that's a great positive, that Japan then becomes a melting pot of international talent. But certainly, I think when I talk to companies that recruit globally, Japan tends to be a big problem for them to find people.
Yeah. So then what tends to draw people to Japan for jobs?
That's a very good question. I think there's a mix. I think there are people who are interested in Japanese language. You know, if you're in Australia, you can learn Japanese in school. And it's reasonably close by, so you'll get people coming over for language reasons. I think in the last few years, we've had kind of the anime and manga boom. So you've got people studying Japanese culture, getting into the culture through these kind of routes, maybe learning Japanese language, interest in Japanese music, J-pop, things like that. And then it's natural, obviously, then to want to come here and visit. There's been a big increase in tourism in the 20 years that I've been in Japan. I think when I came to Japan, we had 1.5 million visitors per year. Before COVID, we were getting up to 2030. I think the target for the government was 40 million by 2020. We're heading in that direction. So you've a lot more people coming to visit. I think people like what they see and kind of think this would be a great place to spend some time. I think Japan overall has a strong reputation. It's a safe place to live. People have a reputation of being polite and friendly, or at least polite. But perhaps depending on the area, you know, whether it's kind of people are more reserved. So, but again, Japan's a big country, so it really, really varies geographically as well. So I think there's a lot of attraction for people to come over here. I think there's a fantastic lifestyle here. Japan did have a reputation of being a very expensive country to live in. I think a certain amount of that has disappeared over the years of kind of deflation. When I go back home to Ireland, prices always seem to be going up and up. Prices here, they've risen in the last few years somewhat, but a lot of things are still close to the price of when I came to Japan. So I think that kind of cost differential of putting people off has disappeared to some extent as well. And then I think perhaps Japan opening up with more opportunities for non-Japanese speakers or overseas people who do speak Japanese to come here and work makes it attractive. So it's a fantastic place to live and work. The word gets out, and I think then people want to come and have a look for themselves.
Yeah, I definitely agree in my own experience that it seems like people tend to go over to Japan because they were exposed to the culture, pop culture or traditional culture. And then they're like, well, I'll just try it out for a little while. And then some of them are staying forever.
Right. Yeah, and there's also martial arts as well. The popularity of judo, karate, kendo, and other things like that can bring people over. Sometimes to come in here for competitions and have a great time and want to come over as well. So there's lots of different various reasons. There's also family reasons. I meet a lot of spouses of Japanese nationals. So maybe a Japanese person goes overseas to work or work or study, gets married, comes back, and the spouse comes back and is looking for a role here as well. So it's pretty common. So there's a lot of diverse reasons. And so for some people, it's just they want to go the opposite side of the world than where they're from. And the furthest place they can get away from home is here. And they say, okay, let's go for it.
Yeah, that may or may not have been part of my reason. And then also the safety, being able to go out in the middle of the night by myself anywhere in the country and have no problem as a woman is not something you encounter in a lot of countries. So
yes, it's fantastic in that respect, and I think even the small things. I've absent-mindedly been reading a book or something on the train, left my laptop in the briefcase up on the luggage rack, got off the train, and then just, oh my goodness, I've left it. And I did that actually twice, and both times I got the bag back. I just called up the train company. They called back an hour later saying it's at such and such a station, please go and collect it. And I'd go up and collect things. So, day to day, there's very low levels of kind of street crime. There's certainly crime of various kinds, but the sort of daily life of muggings and street crime and issues that you see in many other countries, you just don't really see here. I've rarely seen kind of physical alterations or things like that. Sometimes perhaps on the train where people, it's a high stress environment, everyone crammed together on the train, but you've got millions of people commuting every morning and very low levels of problems. So I think then for people who want a safe place to explore, so it's different enough that you can learn and explore, but then safe enough that maybe you can tell your family not to worry so much compared to traveling in other parts of the world, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, something to remember is if you lose something, it's always worth checking. Even if it's cash, it's always worth checking the lost and found to see if somebody's returned it, because the odds are in favor.
Yes. Yeah. And I've left my wallet in the taxi and got it back 6 months later, everything intact, all kinds of stuff like that. And my friends have very similar stories. So perhaps it could make you a bit, what's the word? Bit blasé, you kind of get used to things. You go to other countries and you suddenly get really paranoid. When you go on holiday somewhere else, like where's my stuff? So you can kind of get used to the sense of safety and security, I think, for sure.
Yeah. So then, moving from all these really good parts of Japan and living in Japan, why do you think managing these high expectations is such an important part of avoiding burning out as a foreigner living in Japan?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I tend to meet people who've been here kind of a short period of time, or people who've been here forever. I think there's a certain hump after a few years that many people go through, that you kind of need to get through, and if you want to stay long term. So I think initially, people are coming here, it's a new life, and maybe they've visited in the past or what have you. So I'm very excited. It's a fantastic place to live, and I think that's very true. So people come here very kind of doughy-eyed, everything's fantastic, everything's amazing, and you get that initial learning phase where you're being exposed to new things, and it's kind of fascinating and fantastic. I think the important thing to realize is, depending on the culture you're coming from, things can be very, very different than you're used to, in terms of society's behavior, the way things work, the way things are set up. I think you have to keep in mind that it hasn't been set up for you. It's been set up by and for the people who were here already. So after a while, perhaps frustrations can come in. For me, for example, apartment hunting in the early 2000s, I'd go and visit a real estate agent. I'd look at some places. I'd say, I'm interested in these. And he'd go and call the landlord, and there'd be a kind of a phone call in the back of a room like this. It's a foreigner. Yes, it's a European. Yeah, is that okay? Yes, it's a guy. Yes, okay. Okay, we'll check his Japanese for you, and then I'm afraid this apartment isn't available. We'd come back and say, well, I just heard you talking to the landlord, and it seemed to be available 20 seconds ago. So you can get frustrated by things, the way things work. An example, perhaps go to a restaurant or bar and people are smoking, whereas in your home country maybe there's been a smoking ban for 10 or 20 years. You can get frustrated. Why are things not like the way they are at home? Well, it's because it's a different place. So I think if you manage your expectations, and can realize that the country isn't going to change for you. You need to adapt and be flexible to be happy, kind of roll with the punches. I think if you can get that mindset and kind of accept the way things are, then your life will be easier, and you can kind of go for that kind of long term kind of stay here. Japan does change. There's been huge social changes. The role of women in society has changed a lot in the last 20 years. Obviously, there's an aging demographic that was resulting in pushes for immigration reform and other things. So Japan does change. It tends to change slowly. and it tends to change in line with obviously what the Japanese people want, not necessarily from external pressures. So I think manage your expectations. You're not on holiday. If your only experience is holiday, working is very different. Before COVID, when we're all heading to offices, you're getting up early, you've got a commute, probably maybe squashed up on a train. People don't typically drive to work. It's train commute in Tokyo. You're working long hours potentially, depending on the company environment. You've got the commute home. You're in a 9 to 5, but probably not a 9 to 5, maybe a 9 to 6 or 7 or 8. And depending if you're in a global company, perhaps evening calls and things like that. So it's very different from being a tourist where every day you're visiting new restaurants or going to Disneyland and things like that. So you can fall into, especially now with COVID and people not venturing out so much, your life here in your apartment or house may not be so different than your life where you are currently in your apartment or house, logging into Zoom, doing your work calls, doing your emails, phone calls with colleagues and customers, things like that. So
yeah, it's not all going to be magical new Japan every single day. It's still real life.
Right. But there's still, it's still again a huge country, very diverse in terms of culture. So there's still lots of new things you can learn. But again, if you're working 40 to 50 hours a week, that's going to be taking up a lot of that time, making a living, paying your taxes, paying your rent, those kind of things. So just, I think, bear in mind that no matter how much you enjoyed your holiday, working somewhere and being on holiday, being on vacation are two very different things.
Yeah. So then you mostly focus on the tech sphere in Japan and in Tokyo more specifically. So
Yes.
what does career progress look for somebody in that field in Japan?
Okay, maybe I'll talk a little bit about kind of the work I do and what the tech scene looks like in Japan as a kind of a foundation. So I primarily recruit for foreign companies here, international companies. I have recruited for Japanese companies in the past and currently, but primarily it's for foreign companies. When I got to Japan, that was mostly kind of financial services, banks, insurance, asset management. More recently, it's probably more technology companies and other kind of service companies. The technology job market in Japan is kind of consists of several sub-markets really that is quite fragmented. So the big split would be between the English-speaking market and the Japanese-speaking market. The English-speaking subset of positions is a much smaller subset of Japan as a whole. Obviously, it's Japan, people speak Japanese and work in Japanese primarily. So you've got then the different kinds of companies, traditional Japanese companies, large companies, the Nomuras and the Mitsubishis. They'll typically hire new graduates, train them up in whatever they want them to do, and kind of release them off for 40 years until retirement. Although that job for life is obviously kind of disappearing to some extent. You've got Japanese small and medium-sized companies, again, you generally working in Japanese. Then you've got the large foreign companies. So, excuse me, that's financial services, pharmaceutical, retail companies, consulting firms, IT vendors and technology, other things like that, and tech firms more recently. Then you've got Japanese companies that are kind of more international, globally minded. So people like SoftBank, Rakuten, Fast Retailing, who own Uniqlo and other clothing brands. These are companies that, for example, Rakuten decided several years ago, to shift their working language to English, to be more internationally focused. So they're kind of, again, recruiting English speakers into the tech scene. And then you've got the more recent kind of startup companies, either Japanese, kind of native Japanese companies, overseas companies, startups coming from US and other locations, or startups founded by foreigners, or a mix of Japanese and foreigners in Japan as well. So you've got these different kind of markets looking for different kinds of people. The complicating factor in many cases is kind of the English side of things. Japan then being a bit behind kind of when it comes to IT globally. There's a lot of legacy systems, there's a lot of outdated technology. So if companies want to compete, they're being forced to really undergo digital transformations, upgrades, moving into more modern platforms. So you've got this several different kinds of scenes within the job market, all looking for talented people, and some of them looking for English-speaking talented people or bilinguals within that. So as I mentioned earlier, that's kind of a lot where the challenges come in. So I think then talking about people's careers. So if you're coming from overseas, you're more likely to find a role in a foreign company, depending on where you're coming from and your Japanese skills. Japanese companies in the last few years have hired more, for example, bilingual Chinese engineers. It's a closer kind of culture than perhaps people from the West, and people have perhaps easier time learning the Japanese language with kanji and so on. So there's more people from China and other kind of mainland Asian countries getting into the Japanese business scene. We see more people then coming over from everywhere into the kind of English-speaking foreign companies. Your career will look probably different depending on then the type of company. If you're in a fairly international type of company, you can expect a career path similar to any kind of global environment anywhere else. So meritocracy, promotions based on results and what you can do, perhaps more innovation and risk taking within the group, leading to more opportunities kind of coming up for you to move into. If you're get into a more sort of traditional Japanese type of environment, you're going to find more rewards based on length of service, age, people being paid according to their age rather than output, and I think perhaps more of a glass ceiling in terms of your opportunities as a foreigner to kind of rise up through the ranks to kind of senior management and things like that. So I do see people come over, maybe working in Japanese companies for a couple of years, but at some point thinking, well, listen, I'm not going to become the group manager. So if I want to kind of rise up, I need to kind of look for a more international environment. And then other people coming straight into an international environment where it can be easy, if you're talented, to fast track into more opportunity as well. So it's very variable on kind of the companies you work in, the industries, and just the view of management to how the company should be run.
Right. So even though the idea of staying at a company for your whole life, the traditional kind of Japanese model, is going away also for a lot of Japanese people, even is less of an option for foreigners. So that means that networking is particularly important for foreigners then, right?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think the kind of job for life, I don't see too many foreigners taking that kind of track. I see people moving more within their industry or even over to kind of adjacent industries. Recruitment in Japan is can be, the process and how things are done can be quite different from in other countries. There's less reliance on the internet. And it's more, Japan has had more either kind of companies all hire new graduates and kind of people into April of every year, or else they're using recruiting agents. I think there's perhaps a tendency to more privacy and less self-promotion. So for Japanese people to put themselves up on something like LinkedIn and kind of say, here's what I do and here's my results, it can be seen as bragging. So it's perhaps socially kind of frowned upon to some extent. Not to say that social media isn't huge in Japan in other areas, but in the workspace, I think it's quite behind. So LinkedIn has, I think, less than 2 million registered users in Japan from a population of 127 million or so. I think Singapore has like 4 million out of a population of 6. So it's night and day. The networking aspect then, a lot of people find jobs through personal connections, through friends of friends, through introductions. Again, often it's kind of quietly done, these kind of quiet introductions, and people kind of make moves, or through agents. Agents are often found through personal introductions. Again, people are somewhat reserved about talking about their salary and their strengths and weaknesses and successes and failures and things like that with strangers. So if they're being introduced to someone to help them, they like that. That there's some level of trust there by being a friend of a friend, or someone who's helped a friend or a colleague in the past. So I think it's a location certainly why knowing people, getting known in the community, and kind of making connections with people can be very, very important compared to other places where it's just more common to apply for jobs online and not meet people face to face in the process and things like that. So I think it can be quite different here.
Mm-hmm. Definitely can see how that would work with the culture being the way it is in Japan. Makes a lot of sense. So then in the tech sphere, this is kind of moving out of something that I can personally speak much about, but what are some skills that are particularly popular for engineers or other people in the tech sphere in Japan?
Yeah. So I think that there's, I think what's kind of popular here or in demand here, and then there's also what people overseas looking to come to Japan, the skills that are in demand for people like that as well. There's some overlap, but there's some separation as well. So I think there's a huge demand for software developers. Front end, back end, full stack developers, web development, primarily things like JavaScript. On the enterprise level of more kind of legacy systems, so Java, .NET platforms, also mobile development, so iOS and Android development as well. Going along with that, I think with a push for many companies to more cloud-based systems, so AWS, Azure, and so on, cloud engineers, DevOps people, replacing the kind of Windows server engineers and Linux admins of the past. So there is a big push by many companies to kind of move things to the cloud, a lack of talent here to do that as well. Also, technical architects and solution architects, people with a broad experience with technology, can design systems and translate business needs into technical deliverables. Recently, in the more recent sort of 2 to 3 years, I see more demand in AI and machine learning, also data science, data analytics, data engineering, as people make use of data platforms and the kind of big data phenomenon. Also then in user UI UX, so user experience design, things like that, as people building mobile applications or other applications, are looking to make them user friendly and efficient. There's always a kind of underlying need for IT support people, so desktop support engineers, help desk people, network engineers, data center people, business analysts, and IT sales, also project management. Many of those, especially if they're interfacing more with the business side, who tend to be Japanese users, tend to be more Japanese language requiring. So I think that if I look at people coming overseas in the last few years, a lot have probably been on the software development side, with DevOps and maybe machine learning, AI, big data following up from that. Definitely for people looking overseas looking to come here, I see very few kind of entry-level positions. Companies are looking for experienced talent who can deliver, because if it was an entry-level role, they just try and hire locally, hire a new grad or someone else locally available, train someone else up. So I get contacted perhaps by people graduating overseas and they want to come to Japan. I think it's very difficult to get an entry-level role like that. Now, if you've also got fluent Japanese, then that's different because you're bringing something else. But if you're an English speaker, new grad, difficult. I would suggest build up a few years of experience in your home country before you kind of look to get over here. So mid-level, 5 to 8 years experience, that's kind of the sweet spot, I think, for many companies looking to bring people from overseas.
Mm-hmm. That definitely makes sense. But what about people who have maybe decided to go into a boot camp in Japan? I know they're a little bit more common overseas, but I have been seeing more and more of them in Japan themselves. Are companies open to hiring people out of boot camps who have just been skilled, or are they still pretty reluctant without experience?
I think if someone's here and done the boot camp here, then companies are more open. If it's someone from overseas, perhaps less, because you've got the whole risk of someone coming from abroad who doesn't settle in, and you've invested a lot of time and money in skilling them up. If someone's already here, certainly there's a few boot camps here that have been kind of turning out successful graduates. Lawagan is one of them that's got a good reputation in Japan. I see people getting jobs in startups or joining companies like Rakuten. So I think if you're here and kind of established, I think bear in mind then, if you're looking perhaps to come here, I think if you came here as an English teacher, then did a boot camp, perhaps you've got an opportunity there. Just remember the kind of visa requirements. You still need that kind of 4-year degree or undergraduate degree or 10 years of relevant experience. So if you're doing a boot camp to learn IT, you're probably not going to have the 10 years of IT experience. You're going to need that undergraduate degree to get your visa sponsored, unless you have a spouse visa or something similar.
For sure. So then what are some skill sets or programming languages even that may not be such a great fit for the Japanese market?
That's a good question. I think, let's see. I certainly see a lot more focus on web development and web-based skills. So less demand for perhaps Java, .NET than would have been five years ago, sort of between 5 and 10 to 15 years ago. I think there's still opportunities, but the startup scene is really is more web focused. So that's probably one area. I think as well, you see people with experience in embedded systems, kind of low level C or other kind of embedded programming. That can be a difficult area to get into because it's typically more industrial, and that typically means more domestic and more Japanese focused, or Japanese language focused. Now, if you've got great Japanese skills coming over from somewhere, then more opportunity there. So perhaps some areas like automotive. But if you're a low-level kind of embedded developer with limited Japanese, I think that can be pretty tough to find opportunities here as well.
Mm-hmm. So we already talked about the tech sphere. We talked about teaching. Are there any other industries that are available to people who want to go to Japan to work?
I think depending on the big delimiter is often Japanese skills. So, if you've got great Japanese skills, you've studied Japanese in university, you've got more open to more opportunity. When I got here, the kind of big three were English teaching, selling pensions and financial services to foreign expats here, and recruitment. I think recruitment still also remains a large employer of non-Japanese nationals. There's a low barrier to entry. You don't need any certification and things like that. That has good repercussions and bad, as there's some great recruiters here and some not very good ones as well. But those are areas I think traditionally that it's been easy. I think there's been more tourism. There's opened up more opportunities in hospitality, especially with the Olympics. So companies were kind of ramping up things. Obviously, the Olympics being postponed pushes things a little bit, but certainly travel, tourism, hospitality, especially for bilinguals. They're probably some of the main areas. Outside of that, then it's kind of looking at some of the semi-skilled and lower skilled type roles, but they can be pretty different. I don't see many Westerners, for example, in construction or agriculture. I see people more from Southeast Asia in those kind of occupations. So I think there's still people, I meet people with kind of quite different types of roles, writers and content producers, things like that. I think if you can get a visa, sponsorship somehow, or if you're a spouse and you've got a spouse visa, then you can look at other areas like that as well. Sales, marketing, sometimes as well, although much of obviously selling in Japan is to Japanese people in the Japanese language, so it tends to have higher barriers for people overseas.
Mm-hmm. That definitely makes a lot of sense. It seems like a lot of the people who are in more unique jobs, they tend to have the spousal visa. So
Right.
the situation just makes things a little bit more complicated. But I have recently heard more about people who have been figuring out ways to make the occupation that they want to do work.
Yeah.
The more standard Japanese visa without getting married to a Japanese national. So there are ways. Don't lose.
Yeah.
Just
there are also if people are, for example, tech people who want to look at starting a business here, there are some kind of special entrepreneur zones. For example, Kobe is one of them. I think Kobe City has an office in Seattle to kind of promote tech into Kobe. So you can get kind of there is an investor visa for people to come to Japan and build businesses, but you have to set up a company. You've got to hire 2 or more Japanese staff. You've got to put 5 million yen in the bank. It's quite high overheads for someone looking to, bootstrap a startup. So places like Kobe, if they like your business plan, will help you get established. The requirements of visa for setting up the business, the capital requirements and the employment requirements and things like that are gone. So you can set up a one-person company and things like that. So the government's trying to look at some flexible ways, but again, they tend to start off small, see what works, and kind of push out to other areas. But that's one area that I think people could look at. Just have a convincing business plan. Typically in technology, healthcare, or other kind of tech-focused areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Fukuoka is one of the other cities.
Right.
We have a pretty comprehensive website about it if anyone wants to learn a little more about the strategic economic zones.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot more information on the internet. I think for anyone who's interested, the internet is your friend now. Lots of opportunities to do research, obviously find out information about visas, things like that. There's a lot of information in English on there. There's a lot of people with blogs and other things talking about their industries, their areas, what they do and how to be successful. LinkedIn, although it has a low number of people, the people here on LinkedIn tend to be English speakers, so either Japanese nationals who speak English or foreign nationals, and people are very supportive. If you came from overseas, you were a new person at one point, and people helped you out. So I think there's a good sense of cooperation and community as well. So look on LinkedIn, look for people who do similar jobs to you. Maybe they're from your home country. Send them a connection request saying, I'd like to follow your footsteps. Do you have any advice? How did you get your opportunities? Could you introduce me to people or agencies? Join groups. Business in Japan is one of the biggest kind of Japan-focused groups, which again, by following the conversation, joining in conversation, can network and get connected to people as well. So there's a lot there. When I came to Japan, I basically went to the bookshop in London and bought a book, living and working in Japan, and that was pretty much it. I had a friend here, so I had that kind of help. I wasn't totally on my own, and as soon as I started working in the company was very supportive as well. But it's certainly easier now to get information, find out information. Podcasts like yours as well, I think, are a great way to help people understand the challenges and the opportunities as well.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Yeah, even though comparatively, there aren't a lot of Japanese people on LinkedIn, the Japan community of expats and people working in industries related to and in Japan is extremely robust. It's very active, yes, and it's insanely valuable. So
yes,
please don't
absolutely.
be encouraged by the fact that there aren't a lot of Japanese nationals on it. The community is still more than worth getting involved in, however you can.
Absolutely. This is the great thing about Japan. One of the reasons I like working in the tech industry is it's so diverse, it's so international, but that goes through the whole foreign community. There's people here from everywhere, and people are very supportive and helpful in general. I think there are also many Japanese nationals on LinkedIn who lived overseas. So maybe you find someone who went to your university or lived in your hometown, wherever that may be. Reach out and connect with people. I think it can take time to build up a trusting relationship with people. Don't be too demanding. I get sometimes emails for help with that take me 20 minutes to read. Start off small, build a relationship, but people are happy to help, I think. So there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of information and facilitation, I think, out there that perhaps didn't exist in the past, which is only a great thing.
You just have to take advantage of it and take advantage of it consistently. is a
Yeah,
big
yeah, yeah. And there's also the opportunity to contribute back as well. I know to contribute and bring perhaps an outside viewpoint if you haven't lived in Japan, that can really help people understand what's going on in other parts of the world as well. So it's a case we do need information and viewpoints from coming into the country as well. And if you're overseas and getting into the online scene, you can contribute in that way as well. Just sharing your experience and stories from your home country and kind of what you see can be very valuable as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a rising tide lifts all ships situations. The more you can contribute, the more that you benefit too.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
whatever you
Absolutely.
can, whatever your specialty happens to be, you can figure out a way to make it overlap with your interest in Japan and find some way to provide value. And then
Yeah,
your kind of come to you, which is
yeah,
great.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
So we actually had a conversation before this one, and you mentioned that it can actually be quite a bit harder for Japanese nationals to get involved in making startups and becoming entrepreneurs than foreigners in Japan. Would you mind talking a little bit more about that?
Okay, yeah. So it's a bit of a generalization, but I think there's an element of truth in that Japanese society is reasonably risk averse. Being an entrepreneur is basically a risky business. So, traditionally in the kind of business world, the white collar world, the path to success was study hard in school, get into a good university, graduate and join a big company, rise through the ranks and retire at 60 with your pension. Obviously, the economy of the 90s and 2000s and the world since then has kind of changed that view. But I think there's still a risk aversion, and it affects many aspects of life. So, if you're looking into setting up a company here, I think foreigners here tend to, depending again where they come from and the culture they're bringing with them as well, but for many places are more welcoming of risk or accepting that risk is going to be necessary to get ahead, and also perhaps see that opportunities may be limited to them here by not being Japanese. And so you can see people taking the option of starting their own businesses and building things up. Japan is kind of the land of contradictions. More people in Japan work for small and medium companies than work for the huge brands. There are many mom and pop stores, restaurants and things like that run sole proprietors and things. So people do set things up themselves, but I think the status, how things are viewed, can be quite different. Joining a big Japanese bank or trading company and very prestigious with your nice me-i-shi and easy to get home loans and mortgages and things like that. So status is still a big thing. So I think the foreign communities, is a large number of people have set up businesses either to kind of face directly into the Japanese business world, or to kind of support the foreign companies here or support other kind of ventures and things like that. So very, very diverse array of things across travel, marketing, obviously recruitment, a lot of foreign founded recruitment companies here, things like that. So I think that's somewhat changing as younger Japanese see role models. It's a bit generational, but you see people like Mikitani, who founded Rakuten, a huge success, son of SoftBank, despite his woes with WeWork and other kind of investments more recently. SoftBank is still seen as a hugely successful company here. Fast retailing and other companies, not necessarily so new, but there are role models that I think younger people can look to and see that, okay, listen, maybe doing my own thing. If I can get around my parents' objections and things like that, that maybe I'll kind of go and try new things. So I've certainly seen more Japanese ventures started by Japanese nationals in the last 3 or 4 years than I saw in the 15 years before that.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that. A couple of students from the school I was studying abroad at, I've seen that on Facebook, not LinkedIn. I've seen their companies and that they've
Right.
started some entrepreneurial ventures. So that's really fun to see for me.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. I think, we're seeing companies like Mercari, the buy and sell kind of flea market app, Japanese unicorn. We see them looking to expand internationally. There are companies in the fintech space also looking to move out from Japan and bring their technology and work to the world. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for Japan to contribute globally as well. Perhaps is because of the geographic location and the low English, there can be a sense of isolation here. But I think we are seeing role models and leaders coming out who are kind of looking at the globe and realizing that to be successful, really have to look at being a global company. We're expanding overseas to some extent, perhaps using English more, and offering a lot of the talents that Japan has to contribute. So it's obviously highly educated people. Things get done in Japan. People come together and get things done. So there's a lot Japan has to offer to the world, I think. So it's nice to see things kind of being developed here and then moving overseas. So, perhaps 5-10 years from now, you will be using that app on your phone that was developed in Japan. Perhaps someone in Canada or Vietnam who's listening to this comes to Japan and joins one of those Japanese companies and helps bring things back to their home country in the future as well, which would be great. I think, Japan has a lot to contribute, and I think it's been a little bit behind, perhaps more recently, the last sort of 10, 20 years, with more internally focused, more domestically focused with the issues, especially economic issues after the fall of the bursting of the bubble in the 90s.
Yeah, I think it's been punching a little bit below its weight in
Yeah.
terms of its influence in international business. So it'll be great to see that change over the next few decades.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So then, do you have a personal example of a communication breakdown in Japan that you've experienced due to culture?
Yeah, I suppose, so from my own experience, if I look back a few years ago, so 7 or 8 years ago, I worked for a Japanese company for about a year. They'd bought the first company I worked for in Japan. And they'd integrated it into their business. I kept a relationship with people there and kind of got invited back in. The sales manager had left the company. They felt they were underperforming, so they wanted to kind of revamp their business. And this is the IT recruiting department. When I joined, I looked at the technology. They were still using technology. It was outdated. A lot of the processes were outdated in the ways of working. So I kind of set a fairly ambitious, perhaps overambitious target of changing things. And I kind of started off kind of group meetings, talking about where there were issues I could see, where we could make improvements, how that would improve things for people. And it seemed that kind of people were on board, and kind of off we went, broke it all down into manageable chunks, started implementing things, then kind of ran into roadblocks. And from some individuals to kind of passive aggressive behavior, I could kind of see things just weren't moving. And I'd made that kind of classic mistake of ignoring the fact that people don't necessarily want to speak out in group situations, and would nod and agree in a big meeting full of their peers, but actually on the inside were like, well, I don't understand this, or I don't agree with this. So once I kind of figured out what was going on, then I kind of had to change tack, change things to more kind of one-on-one meetings with individuals to really get down to people's real feelings and motivations and feedback. And then I could kind of combine that and then kind of work with the group. So I think just looking at things that people tend to communicate differently in Japan, depending on where you come from, but certainly if you come from somewhere like the US, with a sort of very direct communication style, there's a lot here that's indirect, there's a lot here that's unsaid. I think I mentioned to you before, when I came to Japan, my kind of culture shock was not working with Japanese people, because I was coming from the UK, which was in many ways quite similar, kind of more indirect. My culture shock was having an American boss and American colleagues who were very direct, and I wasn't used to that. So I think just being aware of different communication styles and different communication cultures is really important. And then if you're working in IT, you could be in a meeting with someone from Myanmar, someone from India, someone from Argentina, and someone from Canada, and then three Japanese colleagues. So in that group, everyone may be coming at solving problems from a different way. a different style. So the only answer is really trying to be very open-minded and keep communicating, and try to learn and understand other people's communication style and view. So yeah, it can catch you up, and it can happen at any time as well. It doesn't matter how long you've been here. You can maybe get into a habit of thinking, well, this makes sense, this is obvious. It's obvious to you, but for someone raised differently in a different culture, it's totally not obvious. So my wife and I have these conversations daily where I think this is the most obvious thing we should be doing, and she can't understand it, and vice versa when she suggests something like why on earth would we want to do it like that. Yeah, be open and communicate. Part of half that's the fun. It can be stressful if you're trying to deliver things and get things done at a deadline, but you can massively improve your communication skills by working with people who view the world differently than you, and you can learn a lot about yourself. Perhaps after a while you start looking back home and thinking maybe the way things were done at home was a bit strange now. You can take on board a lot of the changes yourself to heart too.
Yeah, wearing shoes inside is definitely one of.
Yeah, I mean, I go back on holiday and I get back to my family's house in the Irish countryside, and the first thing I do is take my shoes off. And I see people with shoes. I watch a TV show and someone's lying on their bed with a pair of shoes on, and I'm like, what are you doing? So the things, you can end up looking at the world quite differently, which I think is fantastic because I think people can default. A lot of the problems in the world are caused by people defaulting to the view of the way they were raised, or their own culture is the only right one and everyone else is wrong. Typically, I think you'll find that we're all a mix of right and wrong, and if you can take the best bits and steal the best bits from other people and integrate them, you can have a kind of an enjoyable life and learn a lot.
Mm-hmm. I would argue, though, that wearing shoes on your bed is just objectively wrong. But I guess that's just my opinion.
Right.
So then, if you were chatting with somebody who was going over to Japan for business, this could be long-term or short-term, maybe in the tech sphere, but they only had time to learn one thing from you about Japan and the culture, what would you take the time to teach them?
I suppose it's a fairly quick one, but worth keeping in mind. Again, depending on where you come from, people in Japan can be quite reserved. And now Japan's a big country, so the average man on the street in Osaka compared to the average person on the street in Tokyo, even in Japan, the reputation will be quite different. The Tokyo people are seen as formal and stuffy, and the Osaka people as laid back and funny. So I think if you're coming here in business, just be aware that it might take time for people to warm up to you, to get to know you and get to trust you, that you're not going to turn up and in your first meeting dazzle everyone with your exuberant personality and make instant friends and be seen as like, wow, look at this fantastic person who's just rocked up. It can take some time to kind of develop rapport with people and develop friendships. But if you bear in mind that just to again be polite, communicative, and open, then I think it's worth bearing in mind, and you can kind of settle in or be more successful.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So sorry about that, but thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate it. I definitely learned a lot, so I'm excited to share this too. Is there anything else you'd like to say to my audience before we head off for today?
Yeah, I guess, just if you're curious about Japan, get online and learn. It's a wonderful place to live and work, whether that's coming over for a year or two, coming over to teach English for a year and then going back home, or coming here long-term to build a career. It's a wonderful country, so don't be shy and look to things. If you're in the technology space, I'm always happy to talk to people and give advice. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Paul Roberts Tokyo. I also started a blog and newsletter recently aimed at kind of English-speaking tech people here. It's a fairly casual and kind of laid-back thing. It's not very corporate. So you can find the blog at paulroberts.jp, and get in touch, and look forward to seeing you in Japan sometime.
Yeah, I actually read through your blog, and it's definitely geared towards IT people, but I think anybody else can definitely get something out of it. So it's definitely worth checking out. And I'll be sure to put the link in the description of the episode too.
That's great. Much appreciated. Thank you.
So thank you. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you sometime next year in Japan.
Will indeed. Take care and see you soon.
I hope that you enjoyed today's conversation, and please be sure to check out Paul's links to learn even more about him and the IT industry in Tokyo and beyond. Even if you aren't thinking about working in technology, his website and blog are still definitely worth a visit. Please remember to go ahead and subscribe and leave a rating and review if you enjoyed the podcast, and feel free to email me at businesssuccessjapan@gmail.com if you have any other questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes or interview topics. And if you enjoyed the episode, please go ahead and send it to someone you think would enjoy giving it a listen. Also, be sure to reach out if you would like to contribute as a guest on the podcast to share your own cultural insights into doing business in Japan. But for now, remember that the more you learn, the more confident you will become as you explore all of the opportunities Japan has to offer you. Until next time, mata kondo.